Her name was Hiroko Kainao. It was a morning like any other. She was a Seventh-day Adventist living in Hiroshima, Japan during World War II. On this day, the sun had risen, the cicadas were singing, and throughout the city, people were beginning their day. But little did they know that everything was about to change in an instant. It was August 6, 1945. The city was alive with the hum of daily life. Children were playing in the streets, merchants were opening their shops, and the residents were completely unaware of the doom that was quietly descending from above. Without warning, a fierce wind howled through the air, a wind so strong that it shattered windows, tore through buildings, and flung debris like leaves in a storm. Hiroko had no time to comprehend what was happening, and in that split second, as her world turned upside down, Hiroko did the only thing she could think of. She dropped to her knees and began to pray. She cried out to her Savior for help as the world around her erupted into chaos, and then everything went black. By August of 1945, World War II had been raging for nearly 6 long years. Victory in Europe had been celebrated in May of 1945, but the conflict was far from over. The war in the Pacific raged on, and President Truman urged the Allies that they needed to remain vigilant, emphasizing that the battle was not won until Japan was defeated. Meanwhile, secretly behind the scenes were the men and the women of the Manhattan Project. And in the early hours of July 16, 1945, at the Trinity test site, they had the first successful detonation of a nuclear bomb. This was a weapon of unimaginable and terrifying power that had officially been unleashed upon the world. Robert Oppenheimer, he's forever known as the father of the nuclear bomb, he marked the gravity of the moment by quoting the Bhagavad Gita, saying, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In July 26th of 1945, the Allied leaders from the United States, Great Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, and this demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, and they warned of prompt and utter destruction if the terms were not met. But Japan, they refused to yield. They were defiant, and the war in the Pacific dragged on. The Allies then devised a plan, and this plan was called Operation Downfall. It was a massive invasion that was aimed at the Japanese mainland, and the thought was that this invasion would actually eclipse even the D-Day landing of Normandy in scale and ambition. But what was the cost of such a staggering invasion? They had projections that were estimating casualties in the millions when they considered both military and civilian personnel. And the sheer scale of such a potential loss prompted the leaders to question whether there wasn't a better alternative to a full-scale assault. And so, ultimately, despite a lot of opposition from General MacArthur, Eisenhower, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and a lot of the scientists of the Manhattan Project, President Truman made a fateful decision. He believed that the overwhelming power of the atomic bomb would swiftly end the war, a choice that he deemed necessary despite the profound moral reservations of its critics. And so the plan was set in motion. Preparations were made, and the B-29 superfortress Enola Gay took off from the runway carrying its deadly cargo, an atom bomb, codenamed Little Boy. And at 0600 hours, the Enola Gay rendezvoused over Iwo Jima with its 2 escort planes, the Great Artiste, which was to measure the bomb's yield, and the Necessary Evil, which was to observe and photograph the explosion. And they headed toward their target, the Aoyama Bridge in Hiroshima. Weather conditions were good. They didn't encounter any enemy resistance. And so at 8:15 Hiroshima time, the massive 9,700-pound Little Boy bomb was released from 31,000 feet and began its 6-mile descent toward its target. The Enola Gay, as soon as it was dropped, immediately veers sharply to the right, racing north to put as much distance as possible between the flight crew and the impending explosion. You see, the bomb had onboard altimeter and barometric pressure sensors that would trigger the explosive sequence. And when this happened, it would cause a cylindrical chunk of uranium-235 that weighed about 85 pounds to slam into a target hollowed-out chunk of uranium, and this would cause a supercritical nuclear fission reaction. And this would happen very quickly. It would happen in 0.15 microseconds as the bomb detonated. On the ground in Hiroshima, the second air raid alarm of the morning sounded. It's the peak of morning rush hour. Hiroko Kainao was in her home. It was a morning like any other. In 0.1 seconds after detonation, the fireball is at least 100 feet in diameter and growing. With a temperature of 500,000 degrees Fahrenheit, ionizing radiation reaches the ground, causing radiologic damage to all biologic matter in its path. By 0.15 seconds after detonation, the superheated air above the ground is a glowing hot ball of plasma. People within a half-mile radius just vaporized. They were turned into the now famous shadow people of Hiroshima, just gone. At 1 second after detonation, the fireball has reached its size of 900 feet in diameter, and there's a shock wave that's rushing across the ground at approximately the speed of sound, and it's bringing with it a wave of wind and fire. And a mushroom cloud starts to form and reaches a height of about 2,500 feet. And it has a superheated air that is setting fire to anything around it that will burn. Now, the plane, the Enola Gay, as it's flying back home, there's a tail gunner. And his name was Bob Karen. He's sitting in the tail gunner position, and he's watching the explosion. And he has the best view, and he described it as a peep into hell. And he continues to watch this as they fly, and he reports that he was no longer able to see the mushroom cloud once they were 368 miles away from Hiroshima. That's how big it was. The blast, it was so powerful that it flattened everything within a 2-kilometer radius. The city transformed into a wasteland, a hellscape, where over 70,000 people perished instantly, dead. And tens of thousands more would succumb to their injuries in the days and weeks that followed. And yet, amidst this unimaginable destruction, Hiroko Kainao survived. Less than a kilometer from the epicenter, she's basically at ground zero when the bomb detonates. The intense heat, the deadly radiation, the force of the blast, none of it touched her. Somehow, in this sea of carnage, she emerged unscathed. And yet, Hiroko wasn't the only one who survived that day. In a miraculous bestowal of mercy, not a single individual of the 21 Seventh-day Adventists in Hiroshima lost their life when that bomb exploded. Iwa Kuwamoto, she was within 1 kilometer of the bomb site when the bomb exploded, and the force buried her under the rubble of her home. She crawls out from the debris, and she sees this mushroom cloud rising into the sky. It's blotting out the sun. And she and her husband are surrounded by these raging fires and are forced with a choice: try to escape or die. But her husband, he's an unbeliever, and he's still trapped in the fallout. And so he urged her to leave him behind and save herself for the sake of their children. He told her that though he had spent his life in rebellion, he now believed in God's salvation and the promise that they would meet again. And so with a breaking heart, she did as he asked. And through a lot of determination and the grace of God, she finds her way to safety. Tomiko Kihara was a doctor that lived a kilometer from the blast, less than a kilometer, and she was sleeping when the bomb fell. And despite being so close, she was unharmed. She was shocked, and driven by her duty, she runs to a hospital at the edge of the city, and she spent the next week working tirelessly to save the lives of those that were injured. And she was able to witness to many of those people about her faith during those dark days. Now, on that day, President Truman, he's traveling on board a ship, and he had a broadcast that was aired, including a statement that said, "If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." But has there ever been an unimaginable reign of terror on this earth before? I think about Sodom and Gomorrah. You have literal molten sulfur balls falling from the sky, literal fire and brimstone. It's a seemingly hopeless situation, except that God's faithful, those that obey God's directive to flee and not look back, they survived unscathed. But what about people that have survived in the midst of fire? I think of Daniel chapter 3. Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, they survived intense fire and threat of destruction. King Nebuchadnezzar had them thrown into a fiery furnace that was heated 7 times hotter than normal. So hot, in fact, that the soldiers that threw them in died. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the furnace, and the ropes that are binding them fall away. They're burned away. But what does Nebuchadnezzar see? He looks into the flames, and he says that he sees a fourth walking in their midst with an appearance like the Son of God. When the fires of adversity are kindled against us, we can be sure that there is one who's closer to us and loves us with an intensity that's stronger than any man-made fire, even an atom bomb. So what if we think about this? What's the conclusion? If it's entirely up to God if we live or die, and we have a true relationship with Him, then we can be at peace with our mortality. It should take away fear in regards to persecution of threats from our fellow man. Death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? We have no need to fear fire because our God walks in the midst of it. And there's a promise about this, actually. Psalms 91 verse 5 says that we shouldn't be afraid of the terror by night, the arrow that flieth by day, the pestilence that walketh in darkness, the destruction that wasteth at noonday. Because 1,000 may fall at our side, 10,000 at our right hand, but it's not going to come near us. I was thinking about this, the pestilence that walks in darkness. Does that sound like a pandemic? I think it does. That means that even when the world is going crazy, we have a refuge and a fortress, and we don't need to have fear. No matter how bad it gets, and we know it's going to get bad. Jesus says in Matthew 24 that unless the days were shortened for his return, that no flesh would survive. So we know it's going to get bad. But going back to Psalms 91 and verse 1, it mentions hiding in the secret place of the Most High, abiding under the shadow of the Almighty. That is the hope that we have. We don't live under the shadow of nuclear war. We live under the shadow of one way more powerful. If Jesus can speak to the storm on the Lake of Galilee, if he can speak to the elements, to the waves, the wind, the storm above, and he can say, "Peace, be still," well, then he can speak those same words, and the elements, no matter how hot they are, they're going to obey. And yet, that still small voice that speaks peace, that's the same voice that speaks to our hearts when there's a storm raging inside of us. You know, researching this story, it really helped me grow my faith, and I pray it helps you grow yours. Please don't forget to like and share this video with others and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out. There's actually some other really interesting stories about Seventh-day Adventists during World War II, such as Desmond Doss, who was on the U.S. side. His story is a little bit more well known. And then there's Franz Hasel, and he was conscripted against his will to the German side. His is an interesting story too, but those are stories for a different time. Thanks for joining me.